And
Right.
then you mentioned that there are some special needs and having a child on the spectrum, and how do you balance the needs of both children and your own needs, and being the primary parent in the home and being a pastor. All of these are very demanding. And then you
Mhm.
mentioned that you also do speaking and coaching. And the other things, like, just because somebody's a pastor don't mean they don't like to go down to the show, or, pick up something to eat or have fun with friends. And,
Absolutely.
you know, that's a lot. And, like what you said, because sometimes we're like, oh, well, everything has to be about being a mother. And it's not so much that, it's just, I think it sounds like what you're saying, and I kind of can understand. If you have to really be grounded, or you get to choose to be grounded in what you're doing, and like be really intentional. Like, is this work? I gotta budget my time and talent and energy. It has to be worth it. If I'm gonna leave the
Hmm.
house and be away from my children, have to coordinate childcare, it better be worth it. It better be something I feel on fire about. I'm not
Hmm.
wishy. I just went through a whole lot,
Hmm.
to make it happen. And you go through a whole lot sometimes just to be late. Like, I'm not saying you don't think of
No, I
myself
get it.
sometimes,
I get it.
because, like, oh my God, I went through all this and I'm still late. But
Hmm. Hmm.
and
No,
and
I
and,
hear
and,
you.
and obviously I'm not in, and so I guess we could say we all have our own ministry, but I'm not in
Absolutely.
the pastoral care. But I can only imagine being a physician. There's this pressure that gets upon you, or this stereotype, or this image that you're not like a real person that goes to the grocery
Mm-hmm.
store, and you don't need downtime, and it's altruistic.
Hmm.
You care
Yeah.
about you. You're serving souls. You're healing hearts, and
Hmm.
that might be dealing more in the physical, but the same person's walking through the door, and you're a finite being connected to an infinite being, obviously.
Yeah.
How do you, or how was that journey like, pre ministry, and then now, as a full time minister of the Lord? How do you
Sure.
balance that?
It's really kind of weird to think about pre-ministry,
You're like, girl, that was
because
21 years
look,
ago.
is it feels like it's been this way for a long time. I mean, I come from a family of ministers, and
Yeah.
so my grandfather's a pastor. Several uncles are pastors on my dad's side. That's my grandpa on my mama's side, and so seeing people in ministry and being, as a kid, I sat with my papa who would be writing messages on a Saturday or over the weekend or what have you, and he'd give us assignments, things to look up so that he can add those things into his message. And so, my post life, if you will, um, yeah, I feel like the things we get saved from continue to be the things we struggle with. So, my personal wound, if you will, has to do with performance based love. It has to do with um, the doing over the being. That I am a 3 on the Enneagram, which means I can outperform most folks just because that's who I am. If you put me in a room with other threes, then it's gonna be, phenomenal. We're gonna do all that we can to outdo each other. We're gonna act like we ain't trying to, but that's what we're trying to do. I mean, it's just part of who we are. And so it isn't a bad thing, except for when that becomes my identity. What I get done or what I don't get done becomes, the measure of my worth. And yeah, that has been my life. So it has come to a head several times, a couple of times, I should say, where it has gotten into my body. There was a point where I had what I would categorize today as a panic attack, but at the time I thought I was having a heart attack. Um, it was a Friday, and I had just finished dropping the kids off to like little school, nursery, or whatever, preschool. And Fridays were my day off at that point back then. And this was like in 2013, and so this is sort of to let you know, like, the thing that we struggle with, pre or post pre anything. It really does sort of go with us, and it may take shape in different ways as you as you level up, as are in new relationships, whatever it might be, this thing it kind of follows you. And I know in church where we talk about leaving our past in the past, and that's true. But I just want folks to know it really there really is there's a semblance of it. It shows up differently later. So it's not that we just keep reliving something from our past, but I think it shows up differently when you're in different relationships, when you're in a different stage of life, when you have children, whatever it might be, it looks different. Same thing, same wound, same hurt, perhaps, but it looks different. So on this Friday, I had was preparing to go do some garage selling, which is one of the things I enjoy, like looking for like antique type things. And so all prepared to do that. And I started getting dressed to actually look decent, to go out into the world versus just dropping the kids off at preschool. And when I got home, I started getting pains in my back. And now I'm a woman who had a doula, so I was like, well, okay, this is something, but I'm guessing it just moved. Thought maybe it was gas or something. And I kept on, getting dressed, getting ready to get out of the house. And this pain just kept coming back with a vengeance. And I remember laying on my red microfiber couch in so much pain and wondering and thinking that if I don't get help, or if I don't call for help, I could actually die on the couch and nobody would know until 5 o'clock when somebody comes home. And so EMT showed up, they, checked me out. They ran all the things that they do, and everything was checking out clear. And I heard one of the EMTs from the back say, well, ma'am, is it possible that you're under any stress? And I told you that God is still saving my mouth. Now, I didn't say this, but I was ready to cuss him out. I'm like, what you mean?
Yeah.
At that time in 2013, 2014 or so, I was serving two churches. The boys were really small. The oldest one had just been diagnosed with autism. My marriage was shaky. We were trying to figure out how to, manage everything. And I think I said I was serving two churches. I mean, I had a lot going on, and my way of managing things was not to manage it. Probably over spiritualize it away, and hope that it would go away, just to push it down. And so in the process of thinking that all the stuff that I was really dealing with was really going away, it really was taking up residence in my body. And so this panic attack took place, and I was in a place of body breakdown and had to really take some time to get back to myself, and really even surpass that and go past who I thought what I thought it meant to be, a person. We sometimes talk about trying to be Superwoman or whatever, or Wonder Woman, and really begin to put some better boundaries in place, prioritize family first, actually prioritize me first. It kind of became a sense where it was charity, the boys, and then church. And so like in my mind, I almost had to work in that order, if you will. And I'm saying this is sort of how it is now. At the time when I was married, of course that looked different, but as far as the priorities, but really to actually work in that order, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so in order for me to work in that order of like God, charity, the boys, I wake up early in the morning to be able to do it in that order. So before I get to the boys, if it's possible, I have had the time to do the things, the spiritual practices that fuel my relationship with Jesus, which it look like prayer. Sometimes that looks like writing for writing's sake, not necessarily authoring a book. Sometimes that looks like reading scripture aloud and doing practices like Lectio Divina, which is a way to read scripture. And so just finding ways to be connected, and then taking the time to do the things that really feel me, from listening to podcasts to meditation, quiet, silence, writing the book, which is how it got done at 5:30 in the morning, sprints of time every day. Of getting it, taking 75 minutes, because that's how long I had before I had to wake up the kid to get the first one on the bus. And so every day, 75-minute intervals or so, whatever that was, I would wake up and write. So, yeah, that's a little bit about, the pre-post, if you will, but like the continual journey. The continual journey is to not get stuck in all of the doing and none of the being. That if I don't do anything else today, if I don't achieve one more thing, I am just as loved and beloved and blessed and worthy as far in the eyes of God, and in the eyes of God, and increasingly so in my own eyes, right? Like continue to own that for myself as well. That if I don't do anything else, I'm okay. And so for others, their journey might be different. They may not have to struggle with the being and the doing, but that for me is where it's at. It's really in the nothingness. I really have learned a contemplative practice of just really sitting still and being still and being in silence. And that's a holy and sacred moment. And that in as much as I sit there, I am well, I am okay, I am worthy. There's nothing I have to do for to breathe or for my heart to beat, and for God to look at me and say, "This is my daughter, whom I am well pleased." And so that's the message. That's one of the messages I think that is throughout my writing, throughout my speaking, throughout my coaching, um, helping people strike. I wouldn't even call it a balance. I would say for me, it has been about prioritization of being first and then doing. So that my doing is sort of filled with what happens in the being. That it's not filled with, the doing could be filled with, trying to please somebody else, trying to get recognition, ambition, all of that. But if my doing actually comes from just being still and just being present, then for me it comes from a place of complete worth, of love. Um, yeah.
And I think that it's so poignant and powerful because, especially for the listeners, being a working mother, you feel like you're dancing to everybody else's tune. You're being judged on the performance of your children, being judged on your performance in the workplace,
Mm-hmm.
and it would present a challenge to just be. And from what I hear, like that sitting in silence and knowing that no matter the outcomes, you're already enough, especially when a lot of the societal pressures and cultural pressures is not good enough, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of women already just beat themselves up being a parent, you know,
Yep.
trying to become a mom. Being in a, and you mentioned being a pastor and also having relational challenges. There's so much shame just in society, then shame being in the clergy, then shame. You know, how did you overcome that to say this is what my family structure may not be what I thought it was going to be, but I have peace in it.
Mm-hmm.
If you could speak a little bit, especially to the mom that is going through those years ago when you're first finding out that, hey, my beautiful baby boy, there's a challenge there,
Mm-hmm.
and this might be an ongoing challenge. So everybody
Mm-hmm.
has challenge, but you know what I'm saying, like
Oh
something
yeah.
significant diagnosis, and you feel alone, or you
Mm-hmm.
don't know how to contemplate it. What can you speak to? What you know Pastor Charity would have needed to hear then, or another mom in a similar
Mm-hmm.
situation?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Um, yeah. It's a great question. So I mean, to be really clear, so that when I give whatever else is about to come out of my spirit in this very moment, when I found out that Gabriel had autism, and that it was in the diagnosis, it was labeled as severe, because he didn't have a lot of speech at 2 years old. I cried. I grieved, and I continue to grieve in reality. Um, what people don't realize, I think, so two things. One, when you receive this kind of a diagnosis around autism, he's 2 years old. He just goes in and plays some games and plays or tries to interact with folks. and they're, 5, a OT, a PT, SLP, all these P's, and the pediatric, um, whatever her title was, she was there. So all these people just watching your kid interact. And so then you come back a second day, and then or the next day or whenever, a week later, and then they give you a diagnosis. So when the developmental pediatrician said, they had kind of known that I was thinking it probably was going to be autism. You can know something, y'all, but until you hear it, it become a whole different reality. So yeah, I was like, okay, it's probably going to be that. So then she told me that. I'm like, okay. And at that point, I was holding it together. Like, okay, I did kind of expect this. I'm going to be all right. I'm thinking to myself, thank you for the information. And, she gave me some packets, and I'm like, okay, we'll start figuring out what we need to figure out next. But what ended up happening in that session is that SLP, OT, all those other people who were present all began to tell me all the deficiencies of my child from their, specialty. Y'all, I could hear it one time, but to sit in a meeting for, an hour and to hear it, four times in very specific ways, I broke down. They was like, we can give you a moment, and I'm like, well, yeah, I need a moment. I remember just sitting there crying. Because I don't know, my entire life was about to be different, and so was his in some ways, and so was my marriages, and so was everything. And so what I want to share with a mom who might be experiencing going through, the space of just loving on your baby. One, they are beautiful, they are beloved, they are gifted, they lack nothing. I see Gabriel as whole and complete. Yes, he has some things to work on, and we continue to, to shore those things up as best we can. But my goal and my prayer for him has always, and for both of the boys, is for them to live into their full potential. And so he is not a child without potential. He is not a child that is done learning and growing. And so we keep working, and we keep loving and seeing what that looks like for him. And so that's the first thing I would say. And that I think any person with any sort of disability, developmental or otherwise, I believe all of those folks, like my son, are close to the heart of Jesus. I believe that. And, I recently had an aunt who had Down syndrome. She lived in her 70s, and she passed away, and which is unheard of in some ways. And, some of the things that, I was starting to kind of hear were things like, when, like she's going to be whole and better when she gets to heaven. And I get it. I get where we were going with that. But I just choose to flip that on the other side, that, it's through the life of my aunt, I got to learn more about who Jesus is and who God is, the kind of love that God exudes for people. I get to see that also through Gabriel every day. And I think that, if we can flip that on its head and say that the people we think don't have it all are really the ones who can show us the most about who God is. I value that to such a degree, to such a I value that monumentally. So that's definitely something he's taught me. And then, lately here I've been talking a lot about grief, and as a community, as a global community, a global collective, we are all experiencing grief in this season of the world, with the pandemic and all that is happening. And that grief is, it's not even in some ways palatable, right? You can't even really touch it. It just is. It's just it's pervasive. It's everywhere. There is a grief that comes when we lose a loved one and they die. There is also grief when we long for something that we do not have, or we long for something that we wish we could have. And so for a mom who has a child on the spectrum, there is a certain kind of grief that's a continual kind of grief. I mean, all grief this is just a grief that it's a longing, right? There's this yearning, and you don't even know that you have it some days until it shows up, until your kindergartner, surpasses your third grader. who's on the spectrum in other types of ways, academically or socially. It's like, whew, that's hard to take in. That's a grief, and that, or when you see, typical children doing things, in ways that, you didn't even think about, like that's something we won't get to do until you maybe see another kid, because you won't even think about certain things, because like this is our trajectory in certain ways, and we're going to go down this trajectory, and then you realize what other 8-year-olds do, and you're like, oh, yeah, I hadn't even thought about that, because we're here.
Yeah.
And so there is a grief that I believe will be ongoing. I think to learn, love, to embrace it, to know it, to name it. It doesn't mean anyone is broken, but to know that grief is not just death. It is all these other types of losses and yearnings as well. And that really, somehow that has been helpful to know. And it gives me permission to, to name it and experience it when it comes up, and to say, oh, that's what that is. That's this lump in my throat right now, why I feel a certain way in unexpected times, when you just out shopping and you see things and you go, oh, whatever it might be. You see another kid. It's just there. And then to get support, to be in community with other folks. Some of the people I hang out with, aside from other pastors, which I love them, but, some of my good friends are from my friends from the other autism mamas. We make plans to go grab, dinner or whatever it is, you got to get up and get going, let's get together, get out the house. Let's be regular. So that is really, so support and allowing the grief to come when it comes.
Wow, that's important, and even wherever you find yourself.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Victorious Working Mom Podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, share, and leave an iTunes review. Until next time.